movements. My name is Kimberly Whitke, and I'm Senior Manager for Global Advocacy at FP 2030, and it's my honor to moderate today's panel. So as we know, and as we heard last night at the opening ceremony, our community is no stranger to opposition. However, something feels a bit different, a bit more insidious, and more dire in this moment. Anti-rights movements are emboldened, resourced, and on the attack like never before. By anti-rights, we mean movements, actors, and hate groups whose operations are often transnational, that are rolling back hard-won rights and freedom. Young people, LGBTQIA, gender diverse people, other excluded groups. They often do this under the guise of family or traditional values, using nice sounding language to disguise and push an extreme and regressive agenda. As my colleagues will illuminate, the stakes are high. Huge amounts of money are being funneled to anti-rights activities, with significant sums flowing from the United States and to Europe to those based in Africa, Asia, and the Latin America, Caribbean region. Restrictive measures and frameworks are advancing globally and in multiple regions, limiting access, narrowing choice, and weakening international consensus on reproductive rights and gender equality. Mis and disinformation are running rampant, especially on contraception and abortion, and massive disruptions to foreign assistance, coupled with the rise of transactional aid, particularly on the part of the United States government, are creating vulnerabilities that anti-rights initiatives are ready to exploit. But as our panelists will remind us, we cannot agonize. We must organize and we must mobilize together. So in a moment, you'll hear some brilliant updates and insights from my esteemed colleagues. I know we're short on time, but we do want to make sure that we have enough time at the end to hear your questions. So if I do my job, we will get to that point. Please be ready to ask those at the end. And with that, I'd like to introduce my first panelist. Jamie Vernald is Senior Policy and Advocacy Researcher at IPAS, tracking and reporting on global anti-rights movements and threats to gender justice. With over 15 years experience in policy analysis and advocacy, she has led investigations in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America on the impacts of US foreign policy, civil society crackdowns, and human rights violations, focusing on women's, children, and LGBTQI+ rights. So thank you, Jamie, and you can advance to the next presentation slides. Thank you.
All right, so my bit, can you all hear me? My bit is to agonize first, so bear with me. And so thank you to Kim, and good morning to you all. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and we're having this conversation on resisting retrogression, obviously at an extremely, as Kim said, timely and vulnerable moment on many, many fronts. But I'm going to focus my presentation on a US-led anti-rights initiative that intersects with others around, or rather against, SRHR, LGBTQI+ rights, and women and children's rights that are ongoing at the multilateral, regional, and national levels. Some of you might be aware that I don't know if that's this guy, less than 2 weeks ago, there was a celebration in Washington, D.C., hosted by, as again Kim said, a rather deceptively named group called the Institute for Women's Health. And they had participants from embassies from a variety of countries, from Hungary to Indonesia to Burundi and Uganda and beyond, as well as US congressional representatives and members of the Trump administration. They came together for the 5th year anniversary of the Geneva Consensus Declaration. For those of you who don't know, the Geneva Consensus Declaration, the GCD as I'll be talking about it, is a non-binding manifesto created at the end of the last Trump administration in late 2020. It's organized around 4 key pillars that are in opposition to improving the health of women and girls in all of their diversity, asserting that there is no right to abortion, defending the definition, as Kim said, of a very narrow view of the family, and privileging national sovereignty over human rights norms and mechanisms. As a report by the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls stated in 2021, they denounced the GCD as an example of the harmful mobilization of states with conservative and anti-women's rights agendas to undermine the well-established and globally recognized human rights of women and girls. And so I'm speaking about this initiative today because at IPAS, as part of our ongoing anti-rights reporting and monitoring, we've been following the evolution of the GCD since it survived the last Trump administration as an organizing anti-rights framework, again, at multiple levels. Back when it was launched, again in 2020, the GCD originally brought together 32 countries, opposed again to SRHR, LGBTQI+ rights, and subsequently the Biden administration did withdraw the US from the GCD, but it's gained since then additional signatories, including most recently at this anniversary party, a 40th country, the Republic of Guinea. So with that, we've reported on this stewardship led by this Institute for Women's Health and some of their leaders who have been doing a lot of this work. We've reported on the GCD and them extensively in 2024, and I'm noticing that with the echo, this gentleman is going to help me. Thanks. Thank you. So we've been, like I said, we've been following them. We've been following some of their staff. And the whole idea is to understand how in the lead up to the US election, this GCD was getting a lot of traction. Some of you might have heard of the Heritage Foundation and its Project 2025. That was a transitional plan for a quote unquote conservative government, read Trump. And the GCD is embedded throughout it as the US decision making on foreign policy, development assistance, which my colleague Beth will talk about, and of course, around abortion. Trump obviously renewed membership to the GCD as one of his first actions in January of this year. And since it's been used as a rallying cry by the US in multilateral spaces at the UN and to target certain agency. And it's also been taken up by the other governments that are part of it and their civil society allies in the anti-rights movement. In addition to all of that, again, this is a document that has no enforcement power. It has no mechanism for accountability, but critically, this NGO that was set up in 2021, the Institute for Women's Health, has created an implementation project. And that's called Protego, and she's been doing that in a few global South countries. So while on one hand, Institute of Women's Health has been doing all this recruitment for new members, they have been trying to get GC member states to implement this Protego project. They've created this optimal women's health framework that's a strategy to guide the implementation of Protego to operationalize the GCD and those 4 pillars that I first mentioned. The framework is geared from everyone to policymakers at the ministries of health, education, but also down to community health workers. So it's all encompassing. It was first actually piloted in Guatemala under the last presidential administration there. In 2023, they actually established several MOUs with different ministries and different ways of piloting these projects with different levels of health workers. Beyond that, they've also established partnerships beyond the government with NGOs and faith-based actors, as well as business leaders. Expansion since then has really focused on Africa. So again, in the last 2 years, there's been this push to get this Protego project rolling out. And in Uganda in May of 2024, there was a ministerial task force actually created in Uganda to implement this project. More recently, at the beginning of this year, Burundi signed similar MOUs with this Institute of Women's Health across ministries of health, foreign affairs, and education. The framework is super jargon heavy. It's only 75 pages, which trying to do all of that is really, really short. And it fundamentally cherry picks what the Institute for Women's Health actually considers women's health issues to be. It purposefully omits scientifically accurate information. human rights-based approaches to healthcare. It perpetuates disinformation about different types of medication. It also, of course, being anti-abortion, it barely mentions contraception and certainly does not mention any form of modern contraceptive methods. It entirely dismisses sexuality and completely omits LGBTQI people, people with disabilities, people facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. No mention is made of adolescent access to information and education around health and sexuality. And in fact, it actually prioritizes, of course, parental rights over children's rights. In these contexts that we're talking about that are already fragile, working with this type of institute could reinforce legal, social, and cultural barriers to bodily autonomy. And that with in mind, in Burundi, we've already had conversations about the risks of undermining long-standing efforts by local and international NGOs to ensure that women and girls have access to quality reproductive health services, including safe abortion care. But through these super high-level connections that the Institute of Women's Health has in Washington, D.C., and then actually in country and specifically in sub-Saharan Africa with African First Ladies, this project is continuing to gain traction. As I mentioned, GCD and this group, Institute for Women's Health, they're just two pieces of a very large, multipolar anti-rights movement, and they intersect heavily with other actions that are being taken by these anti-rights individuals, groups, and states. And so I want to turn to actually some of those that are lifting up the GCD in different spaces in the region. Some of you might know that there was what was called the Third African Regional Interparliamentary Conference on Family Sovereignty and Values, which was hosted by the Parliament of Uganda with the US hate group Family Watch International. And that was in May of 2025 this year, that had not only participation again from the Ugandan First Lady, but also the president. And as a reminder, Uganda was actually one of the founding members of the Geneva Consensus Declaration back in 2020. Throughout this conference, just in May, to a group of parliamentarians from throughout the region, delegates from Uganda were telling people to sign up to the GCD since it seeks to protect the African family. And Family Watch International's executive director said, once you all join the GCD, we shall have a big voice that can be heard. Immediately following that conference, there was another Family Watch International led with other anti-rights groups from the US and Europe, all went to Kenya for the second Pan-African Conference on Family Values, which was an event that was much more geared towards civil society as opposed to the Ugandan one. It was hosted by a group called the African Christian Professionals Forum, which has deep ties to Family Watch International and other global North groups that we've been following for many, many years. We have actually a separate report on them that we can share. And of course, this conference, again, in addition to other really harmful things that we could talk about at length that I won't, it again referenced the GCD. In fact, the Institute for Women's Health, as you can see way up there, was one of the key partners listed along with, I mentioned the Heritage Foundation, Family Watch International. They actually then scrubbed the website, but we have the receipts. Thanks for goodness for archiving. But what's really concerning here is, again, that this Institute for Women's Health has been wanting to roll out Protego in Kenya to not very much success. But because of her connection with the First Lady of Uganda, she actually hosted an event in Uganda for First Ladies, which included a representative of the First Lady of Kenya. So all that to say, for this 5-year anniversary that I mentioned, Trump actually sent a letter to the participants that was read at the celebration, where he congratulated the GCD and claimed to be unwavering in protecting the sanctity of every human life and a voice for the voiceless, while being steadfastly devoted to restoring a culture that values the inherent dignity of every child. For those of you who don't know, the US has just cut benefits for children within the United States to access nutrition. So we wonder who those children are. What we know fundamentally is that any policy or program or project that is based on the GCD is catastrophic for bodily autonomy and reproductive rights. With the backing of the current US administration, and the operationalization of the GCD in certain countries with this Protego, we should all be concerned and watchful as human rights activists, policymakers, ministers from other governments, and health practitioners at the end of the day for what's coming out of the US and being extremely skeptical of what they are talking about. So the groundwork has been laid through this GCD in terms of the ideology coming out of this administration. And we need to be ever more careful because of the context of extraordinarily vulnerable countries at this time who are open to US foreign assistance because of the cuts that have been done to the USAID, well, the decimation of USAID, other foreign assistance cuts throughout the world. And there's just so much room for anti-rights to continue to grow and flourish in this fertile environment for them. Thank you. Do I press the button? Press the button.
Want to make sure I only have one microphone going on here. All right. Thank you so much, Jamie. It's always sobering to kind of hear the arc of the Geneva Consensus Declaration, but it is important to be talking about this as an organizing space and seeing what we're up against, and also then how do we position ourselves to fight back. And I would just say that with the sort of renaissance again of this Geneva Consensus Declaration, one thing FP 2030 is doing is taking a look at our commitment making countries. We actually just did an analysis and found that 14 of our current FP 2030 government signatories are actually also signatories of the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which, as you can see, is starting to create these contradictions between rights-based national plans and programs and these restrictive policy frameworks. And as Jamie was just mentioning, given what's going on with the severe cuts in U.S. foreign aid and some very recent, even hot off the press developments with our U.S. foreign policy, it creates really dangerous opportunities for anti-rights to come in, which is actually a perfect segue to our next presentation. So Beth Schlachter is Senior Director of External Relations and Advocacy at MSI Reproductive Choices. Over the past 20 plus years, Beth has led global advocacy for the International Planned Parenthood Federation, served as Executive Director of Family Planning 2020 and 2030, and was a career U.S. diplomat where she defined and guided U.S. priorities on sexual and reproductive health and rights as a foreign policy issue. So we're very happy to have you come take the podium, even though the news you will share will be quite sobering. Let me turn on your mic, and I'll turn mine off. Clickers.
Hello, everyone. As Kim said, when we first came together to do this plenary months back, I had a different presentation for you, but because we're in a new moment, we agreed that it would be helpful to share with you things that have been evolving rather rapidly from the Trump administration with regard to how it is funding global health. So I want you to think of the first 9 months of the Trump administration as round one. We all experienced this together. We know what happened. USAID was torn down. Programs were shuttered immediately with no warning. A lot of damage was done with no planning. Absolutely malicious and catastrophic. But unfortunately, that really was round one. And now that they've taken down the system of US foreign assistance, the Trump administration is rebuilding it in a way that suits their purposes and in a way that is comfortable to them. Another important fact to remember is that during this collapse of US foreign assistance, 84% of the funding was cut, but 16% remained, and other funding is likely to come back in around the things that they care about. So that's what I'm going to be talking about with you today, is what we are looking for in a refunded, or to fund it again, I should say, US global health strategy. Because the US government is currently shut down, because budget negotiations have broken down, we're going to be sharing with you things that have been released, that we know about, things that we are looking toward and ways of sort of conceptualizing all of this so that we can be ready for whatever does actually happen through these new negotiations and when we actually have a government that starts again, if we ever do, or has a budget which they can actually legally allocate to global health assistance. So first, I want to take what Jamie talked about and put all of this into a broader conceptual framework, because I know it can be kind of confusing to have different policies and programs and processes sort of all linked together. So I want to take you back to the first thing the Trump administration did that was a real change in its foreign policy in 2019 under, again, the first Trump administration, where they pulled together, they convened a committee to review the U.S. posture with regard to human rights. And these were conservative academics and legal scholars and others who were brought together for the purpose of helping to reposition for the Trump administration how they conceptualized human rights vis-a-vis economic, social, and cultural rights. And it will be no surprise to this room that the findings of that committee were that the U.S. government had been over-implementing, in their view, human rights, and that it's actually God's law or natural law that supersedes human rights, and that economic, cultural, and social rights, where they position the things that we talk about with regard to reproductive rights, were actually soft law and not to be considered human rights at all. And that's important because that's the framework that they then use to craft the Geneva Consensus Declaration and the Protego program. That's their sort of intellectual framework for that. Then, of course, they lose power for 4 years, and we now know they use those 4 years very strategically to plan and to be ready to come back into power in ways that we're experiencing now. And in September, they released the America First Global Health Strategy, which is our first view into what it is they intend to fund and the way that they intend to do that work. And that's where we're seeing a real emphasis on pandemic response, not only HIV, but also Ebola, things like COVID, like we all lived through, Zika, Marburg, and others. Because one of the things that happened in the early days of DOGE, if you remember that acronym, when the US government was being rapidly taken down, is that a lot of the systems that the US government and WHO and the world had been counting on with regard to disease surveillance had been destroyed during that process as well. They tried to rebuild it with some success in some ways, massive holes in others. And so part of this reinvestment under the new America First Global Health Strategy is also a way of focusing on pandemic response. Again, you'll remember that PEPFAR has been a massive US government investment for many years now, and many countries have built up their surveillance processes through these PEPFAR programs. And this will be important when we come to talking about the compacts in a minute. So I'll ask you to hold that thought for just a moment. Another thing that we're looking at is the potential for a global gag rule to be expanded even further than it had been under the first Trump administration. For those who don't know what the global gag rule is, it prohibits currently it prohibits any non-US government, any non-US based NGO, and in a flow down way to all of their subgrantees from referring for abortion, advocating for abortion, or working, providing abortion services, which is prohibited in other ways and in other law. But this is a way that it has a real stifling impact on how abortion is provided and how contraception is provided, because it gets vastly over implemented by many people. So if there's going to be an expanded global gag rule, then we know that that's going to be something very challenging for the sector. So what we're looking for is the possibility that this global gag rule will be extended in 3 important ways. The first is it would go beyond applying to just non-US based entities, to apply to all NGOs, and for the first time as well to also applying to multilateral funding and to applying to bilateral assistance. Again, that's a vast expansion that has never existed before, and we'll talk about some of the ways in which that can be really dangerous to family planning programs and certainly to abortion programs as well, and to sort of broader reproductive health. The second way that it's likely to expand is to go beyond prohibiting or restricting activities that are funded under global health to all U.S. foreign assistance. And I know that our group is really focused on reproductive health, but the U.S. has been the major donor to a lot of other development areas as well: education, infrastructure, you name it. So coming back in with an investment package to a country that restarts some foreign assistance across the board is a very enticing opportunity. And the last way that this would apply is that it would extend beyond prohibiting, or could potentially extend beyond prohibiting abortion activities to also including activities that support LGBTQI persons, around gender, and prohibiting around DEI as well, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And part of what we're doing is looking at how these things are playing out in the United States for indications of the ways that these things might be applied internationally as well. And a few weeks back, the Trump administration, you may know that many universities have lost tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases, of research grants since the Trump administration has been in power. They recently wrote to 9 universities and said that they can go to the front of the line to be considered for having some of this investment reinstated if they agree to certain stipulations. And one of those was related to gender, where they said that these universities would have to agree that gender is a binary and make proactive statements saying that there are only male and female genders as a condition of receiving domestic funding. So that's an indication of something that they may choose to request from governments as a condition of receiving U.S. foreign assistance. So again, these are all things that we're looking for. We know that there's a draft strategy that's circulating at the State Department. 75% of the State Department has been furloughed because of the government shutdown. So we expect that this policy may need to wait until the government reopens. That's if the Trump administration follows the law. They often choose to just do things and then wait to be sued and wait for the judiciary system to catch up with them as a way of pulling back. So they may wait until the government reopens, or they may choose to push this out. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. So when it comes to the funding that we are expecting will come through, again, we just have to look at what's happened so far before the government shutdown to indicate what might happen next. So when negotiations broke down in Congress over the budget for the fiscal year for the United States, which again started on October 1st, what we had was the funding package that the Republican-controlled House of Representatives have put forward to the Senate. And the way the funding process works in the United States is the president puts forward his budget request first. He had zeroed all this out, but the House put forward this proposal that you see before you, which asks for $9.5 billion in global health assistance. 2/3 of that would be for PEPFAR, for HIV-related activities. And then another proposed $3 billion for activities related to maternal child health and to fight infectious diseases. And then within that, bizarrely, is also $461 million for family planning. Now, that might just be muscle memory from those who draft these appropriations documents every year. That is really the initial stage of what these negotiations are. So I wouldn't necessarily count on that family planning money living, but let's just roughly consider that there might be somewhere around $10 billion that would be part of what the U.S. government would be negotiating as compacts with governments going forward. And this is where I'm getting to information that I just received a couple hours ago. We know that the U.S. government has been engaged in negotiating compact agreements, which would create the conditions for U.S. government assistance, as I said, to be coming back in. It's the PEPFAR teams that are leading on these negotiations. When USAID was collapsed or destroyed, most people lost their jobs. The team that remained most intact was actually mostly working at the State Department, though, of course, CDC, NIH, USAID also had folks working on HIV. But that's the team that was the most intact, and they are the ones that are negotiating these new funding compacts with partner governments. And so what we received this morning is the draft MOU. The negotiations, these compacts are taking the shape of a memorandum of understanding. And so we received the draft language for the MOU and the guidelines from the US government for how to negotiate these compacts. And you won't be surprised that most of the language in these compacts pertains to fighting HIV. Again, because these are the teams that are managing the negotiations and because that's where most of the U.S. Assistance remains. It provides space for tuberculosis, malaria, and maternal and child health activities, but it's almost as an add-on. In the language in the guidelines, it actually has to remind U.S. negotiators to include those activities from the beginning if it's a government priority. Because again, most of this is around pandemic surveillance, HIV activities, and how they will work together going through that. So I just had a chance to do a quick skim of these, and I want to pull out a few points that I think are really important. We may find on closer reading that there's a lot more in this, but I want you to think about the global gag rule and how it might apply to governments. Governments who are paying the salaries of nurses, doctors, midwives, governments who have integrated data systems, governments who manage warehouses for commodity distribution, where things are integrated into one system. So as you think about the global gag rule prohibiting activities, if there are abortion-related activities in a country, or even we don't know yet if they will seek to prohibit some contraceptive-related services because as a matter of foreign policy, the State Department has also said that they consider some methods of contraception to be a new term they created called abortifacient contraception. And that would include implants, injectables, and IUDs. So it remains to be seen how proactive are at trying to prohibit even the distribution of those commodities should they wish to do so. So these MOUs stipulate from the outset that they are subject to the availability of funds. And that's because the government shut down. We don't have a budget. They can't legally obligate the expenditure of any money. Don't have them within their role to sign now. So again, the MOUs will be finalized when the US government reopens. So that means there's space right now for negotiations with countries and to talk about how this will play out, because theoretically, the money won't be available and an expanded policy won't be available until the government reopens. But we know that these are actively being negotiated now. The MOU also says that within 90 days of signing, they expect to develop a detailed implementation plan with precise timing mechanisms for all areas of cooperation. So again, even if when you get home, you find that your government has already signed an MOU, know that this implementation plan is going to be critical, and there will be 90 days where we should be asking, can NGOs be a part of these negotiations? Because we haven't spoken to a country yet where their government pulled in any NGOs, not even HIV colleagues, into the negotiations. This has all been done in secret in every single country. So that must be by design. But this gives us a window of opportunity, even if the MOU itself is signed by the time you get home. The next is it says that it's going to set up a steering committee, a joint health cooperative steering committee with senior representatives from both governments and other key stakeholders as mutually decided by the government and the US government, and that there will be quarterly reviews on progress and then annual reviews of the MOU. Now that might seem like a pretty heavy-handed review process, but for those who are familiar with PEPFAR, that's actually a lot less than what they typically do. So that should be anticipated, I think, by government partners. A next important point is it says that they want to make sure that investments are included that are of most value to the partner governments. And this is a quote, "They are the most necessary to saving lives." And one of the things the US government stipulated over the summer is that family planning was explicitly included as a life-saving intervention. And so if these activities are going to be allowed, and again, this is allowed with US foreign assistance, then they would have to be considered to be life-saving. But if I'm sorry, I know this is rather complicated, but if a global gag rule applies to all health activities of a government, it would be incumbent on the government to say they consider family planning related activities as life-saving, and they consider abortion related activities to be life as well. And to remember, as Jamie said as well, the US government is highly transactional and that they are negotiating with countries. So there's space here. We don't think the global gag rule will go away. It is going to be applied in some form, but how it gets applied and what this looks like under these 90-day negotiating plans is going to be the really critical component. Next, it also says PEPFAR pays for the salaries of thousands of healthcare workers across Africa and in some Asian countries and in Haiti. And it says that PEPFAR will continue to pay for the salaries of the people they're already paying for now, but they want to make sure that they are including community health workers and that we're professionalizing community health workers, which is actually a beautiful concept. But if we're professionalizing and the US government is paying their salaries, then those healthcare workers who we know do all sorts of activities. They don't just do HIV related activities. They could potentially be prohibited from doing other related activities, including abortion or family planning. And I just have a couple more points for you. In the MOUs, we see where they do refer to abortion, they refer to Helms language, which if you are familiar with US government language, it again just prohibits activities related to abortion, but it specifically commits the government to providing to the US government any data and access to information needed to monitor compliance. And they've already been gathering intelligence as a condition of current PEPFAR funding, asking, what are your abortion laws? What are your policies? Who are your implementing partners? And what are the people's names who are working on this? So they've used this funding already as a vast intelligence gathering network to know who we are at a name level and at an organizational level, which I think we should look at as a pretty scary development. Leave themselves room within the MOU for additional commitments that may also be requested into play. And I think that's where they leave themselves space to bring in the global gag rule at a time when it could be negotiated. And then lastly, they stipulate that the agreement should be signed by a head of state or a Ministry of Foreign Affairs or of Financial Affairs. It needs to be somebody with the authority to sign. Last I heard, not all ministers of foreign affairs have the authority to sign that kind of an agreement, but we'll see. But it does not allow for it does not ask for the Minister of Health to be the signatory on these agreements. So we would expect that the governments themselves would pull in the Minister of Health with the negotiations. So as you can see, these things are in play. There's time for all of us to ask our governments, well, your governments, I know what mine's up to for the most part, what's happening? What is the state of your negotiations with the US? And are you aware of the potential for further prohibitive policy restrictions to come in? Where we have managed, where some colleagues have spoken with governments already, what we've heard is a lot of confidence that they think it's going to be fine, that they have seen the global gag rule play out with organizations, and they believe that they can manage receiving things like maybe Buffett funding for abortion-related activities and continue to operate because they've done that in ways in the past, but they've never themselves been subject to the global gag rule. And so this is a vastly different enterprise than ever before. And I take you back to that concept of one warehouse, one data system, one set of healthcare workers. And you can see that given that many governments are needing this funding to come back in, that they may very well be willing to not allow abortion-specific related activities or others as well to take place. So now is the time for all of us to talk and to share, to ask governments. It's the time for donors, for joint demarches at the country level, to just ask Government X, how are you planning to potentially implement what the US government is asking? while we're already funding you to do these other activities. How are you going to do that? And how can we support you in this negotiation process so that we don't put governments on the spot? Many are very excited that the US government is just coming back in with a funding block and trusting them with this funding. We already saw the US government allocate $250 million to the government of the Philippines on September 11th without any real stipulations around what's attached to that funding. So this is happening. It's just a matter of what gets prohibited as it unrolls. And that's where I point to all of us to work together to mitigate the worst harms that we can over the coming weeks and months. And we will be sharing these MOUs. We're just putting it together so we can send out an email to folks in the coming hours so that everybody has this information and can use it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. You really help us make meaning out of all of this madness and just for being so open and transparent with all of this information. Some of these details are very late breaking, and I appreciate the specificity, the calls to action, the things that we can be doing right now and when we go home. I'm going to keep us moving along because we are tight on time. We're going to shift our focus from the US and to go to Europe. And with that, I'd like to introduce Neil Dada. He is the founder and executive director of the European Parliamentarian Forum on Sexual and Reproductive Rights, Global Parliamentarian Alliance. And he's a leading voice on sexual reproductive rights and the global pushback against gender equality. So it's my pleasure to invite you to the stage.
Thank you, Kim. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning and to speak after Jamie and Beth. I'd just like to start by saying that earlier this year, we came out with a report where we tried to make sense of everything that we were hearing coming out from the United States and the Trump administration. We entitled this report Beyond the Chaos. And if you remember back in the beginning of the year, we were all overloaded with information about what was happening in Washington, D.C. from the new Trump administration. And from our perspective, none of it was good news, okay? And so this is why we entitled it Beyond the Chaos. We tried to make some sense out of it, and we tried to break down what we thought was likely to happen to the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights from a new Trump 2 administration. And basically, we divided up what we expected to happen into 3 phases. The first phase is what we call destruction. And I think that speaks for itself. We knew that with the Trump administration, with any Republican administration since 1984, we can expect defunding of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So we, our friends at IPPF, MSI, UNFPA, they were prepared as soon as November 5th rolled around. They knew what the game was up. One thing I think we all collectively underestimated was what happened to USAID. Okay, so that was a level of destruction that we did not anticipate. The next phase after destruction is what we called consolidation. Okay, and consolidation is what we took when we took a look at what had the previous Trump administration done, and as to lay the foundations, and what were they likely going to do afterwards. So they've destroyed everything. What are they going to do next? And that was going to be the Geneva Consensus Declaration, as well as the other documents that that Beth mentioned. They were going to engage in anti-gender, anti-SRHR diplomacy. And I think we needed to be prepared for that because it had happened in previous Republican administrations, but not to the level that we saw here. And I think Jamie and Beth both very well explained this. But then the third phase is what's interesting. We call this third phase, after destruction and consolidation, creation. Okay, and here I'd like to read a quote from Pablo Picasso. Every act of creation is first of all an act of destruction. So with the destruction and the consolidation, we need to ask ourselves, what are they going to create? Because it's not just destruction for the sake of it, okay? And so this creation is what I want to take a look at. We've already heard a very good idea from this, about this from Beth, and I'll take us through a bit more detail. Okay, I don't have a printout of my PowerPoint in front of me, so I have to read it on the screen just like all of you. So we did another study earlier this year called, which we released at the end of June this year, called The Next Wave. And it takes a look at how the funding for religious extremism and anti-gender activism in Europe is being funded. So we took a look at all of these different anti-gender organizations. We took a look at the funding behind them, and we tried to make sense of this. So basically, looking at the 2019 to 2023 period, we were able to find that there's about $1.18 billion going into this movement in Europe here. I'm talking about not the US, not Africa, elsewhere, but Europe. 1.1, almost 1.12. When we compare this to similar figures from the 10 years preceding, we can see that this is more than a doubling of the amount of anti-gender funding in Europe. So this happened at a time when we knew this was happening, and Europe, compared to the US, is still a relatively progressive, safe space for sexual reproductive health and rights. But we can see how this funding is increasing. We divided this up into different categories. So we know that these anti-gender organizations, they're active in advocacy, lobbying. We know that they have their own ecosystem of foundations. So there's an anti-gender equivalent of the Gates Foundation, of SIF, of Buffett, whatever. And we also saw that there's some governments behind this. But also, one thing that we really wanted to highlight is a new thing that had come across our attention, which I think all of us sort of knew that it exists, but we hadn't paid that much attention to it. And that is what we call anti-gender services. So these are actual programmable services that go against sexual and reproductive health and rights. We're familiar with the contestation, okay? We know that whenever we talk about abortion or family planning or LGBT rights, they're there, to oppose us. I think we had underestimated how they have actual alternatives to all of the programs that we are working on, and that those are ready to be rolled out, and those are being rolled out in a certain number of cases. And I think this is important to keep in mind when we connect back to what Jamie and Beth were saying, because the legal framework that Jamie mentioned, the potential funding and the compacts that Beth mentioned, those are ready to jumpstart these anti-gender services around the world. So it's useful for us to be mindful of this. It's not just the US and other actors are not just destroying things, they are creating a new world, in part thanks to these anti-gender services. So what are they? So basically, we've identified 5 main categories of anti-gender services, okay? We have, in the field of family planning, instead of actual family planning, access to contraception, we have natural family planning. Related to this, instead of fertility treatments, we have NAPRO technologies. Now, basically, just think back to the basics of family planning. Natural family planning and NAPRO technologies, it's basically the same thing. It is the Vatican-approved rhythm method, where you give a woman a calendar and a thermometer and wish her good luck, okay? And basically, you do the family planning, you want to space the births, you do the NAPRO, the fertility treatment, in case a woman wants to give birth, okay? But it's the same thing. But they have been able to commodify this into different services, and they've gone modern. You have modern applications, etc., for this. Then you also have, in terms of unwanted pregnancies, crisis pregnancy centers. So I think that's something that, and other things like this, but crisis pregnancy centers. Then for sexuality education, this is something I think many of us are familiar with, chastity-based education, basically abstinence-only education. Previous Republican administrations had done this, but now they've been it's not just Americans doing this. There's also models for chastity-based education that come from different sources. You can see there the laws in modern these laws. Okay, that's a chastity-based education operating in some 20 countries in Latin America, Europe, Africa, elsewhere. It was qualified by the French government as to be run out, delivered in schools. So it's not just in different countries that it's happening everywhere. Also, LGBTQI rights, gay conversion therapy has been banned in many countries. It's suffered really a bad brand reputation. So they've had to reinvent it, and now it's reintegrative therapy, which is basically conversion therapy light, but done by the same family of people. Another thing that I wanted to point out is from our findings in the research on the next wave is a category of non-governmental organization that we have known has been operating there. We've sort of known there's something fishy about them, but we hadn't quite put a name on this. So what we've done is we've categorized them as what we call them church organized NGOs, UNGOs. So these are basically legally registered NGOs, like many of you in this room. But when you scratch beneath the surface and you take a look at who founded them, who's on board, funding them, and what are they actually doing, you quickly find that these are not just faith-based organizations. You have many faith-based organizations doing good work, not necessarily faith. But this specific subset of organizations basically is the civil society outreach of organized religious institutions. Okay? And I think we need to recognize this for what it is. And these chongos are the people involved in these chongos are the ones who develop the curricula for chastity-based education, who developed the technical guidelines for natural family planning or NAPRO technologies, or who came up with a rebranding of gay conversion therapy into reintegrative therapy. So chongos, remember that. Let's see. Okay, and here I'll have to move a little bit because I really don't see the screen from where I am. But we had tried to identify 5 phases by which these anti-gender services are able to develop. So first, in the first phase, you have leaders of these chongos who take religious concepts, okay, and then find a way of secularizing them into language that sounds acceptable. So one good example is Protego, what Jamie mentioned. Basically, you take a WHO document on family planning or something like that, but you do careful editing to remove all the spicy bits that you don't like from a church doctrine perspective, and then what's left, then you keep that, and then you present this as technical guidelines for your alternative anti-gender services. So it's very deceptive because for people who are not in the know, they will think this looks like what I've read from WHO, but it's been carefully edited. So you do that in phase 1. Phase 2, you get the chongos to sort of implement them, to implement these services in small local level, okay, a school here, something like that. From there, you then seek to get some local authority to approve of it, you know. So you've been running this in a Catholic school somewhere, then the town or the municipality thinks this is a great idea. It actually fills a service because we don't have anything else. So then they start the official seal of support from a certain authority, and then from there it develops. And then finally, you can ask for the political and institutional backing in order to take this up to scale, to regional level, to national level. So you have that type of 5-phase development taking place for anti-gender services. And let's see, I still don't see this one. So these anti-gender services, I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not just that they offer an alternative to things that we are rolling out and that we don't like them because they don't adhere to rights. There are genuine health risks. So that, for example, with Teen Star, which is a chastity-based education developed by Chongo with the founder comes from Venezuela, but it's been then spread to a number of different countries. It's implemented in several countries in Europe, Latin America, Africa. It's been funded by the Hungarian government at a large scale in Nigeria. In Germany and in Austria, it's already been found to go counter to equality and LGBTI legislation. The benefits of these anti-gender services are often overstated, and there's increasing peer-reviewed evidence for this. The services are often, these anti-gender services, basically when we take a look at where do they come from, you find the same groups of people running anti-gender services who are also doing the anti-gender, anti-abortion, pro-life organizations. So this is more or less like a side gig for them that they use for income generation. And then finally, we're seeing that the provision of these entry points are being used as an entry point for larger initiatives such as Project 2025. So, and here's an example of some of them. The picture at the bottom there comes from Teen Star, this chastity-based education, which presents this person wearing a safety outfit with all the apparatus there being presented to a child, as that is what safe sex means. Okay. So you can see there's a little bit of disinformation there. Now, here's an overview of where these anti-gender services are being operated now. We took a look at the African continent, okay? So you see there's that same African Family Values Conference that Jamie pointed to in her first, in her presentation. And so you see there, from that lays the groundwork to establish the political support for rolling out these anti-gender services. From there, you have chongos, operating in a number of these different countries, usually local, in this case, we're looking at Africa, so local African groups partnering with European or American partners, and then they're rolling out these different anti-gender services in their country. And so now just think, these are already operating at pilot level in varying degrees. Once the US funding comes in, just think how these can be scaled up. They're already present in these places there. And just Teen Star, this abstinence-based education in Africa, is already operating in what it looks like about 12 countries in Africa now. And so I'll end here. So just to remind us, with what happened in the US, destruction, consolidation, now we're in the phase of creation. We've heard the early warning signs from Beth about what could be happening with these compacts. Also, I would just like to add, it's not just the United States that's doing this. The US will probably be the biggest injection of money going into these potential anti-gender services. I think this is something we all need to get our heads around, but there's also other potential funders in this respect, either knowingly, such as the government of Hungary is also funding a number of things in this space, but also unknowingly, one of the natural family planning apps that is being developed by one of these youth anti-gender organizations is mistakenly being funded by the European Union as part of promoting women's health program. So I think we need to understand how deceptive these things can be. And I would urge us to follow what Beth had suggested and to be mindful to look at not just what's being destroyed, but also what is being created in its stead and what is likely to happen, what we need to be prepared of in the months ahead. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Neil. You really helped us pull back the veil on everything from terminology to some of these really sneaky approaches, to even showing just how highly networked and interconnected all of this funding and activity is. We are running short on time. I was told that we had an extra 5 to 10 minutes, so that will give you enough time for your piece, Paula. So we'll have to reassess on the Q&A. But it is my pleasure to welcome Paula Salwandar to the stage. She's a senior director for collective action at Women Deliver, also a Lebanese feminist activist from the diaspora and a human rights lawyer by training. So she will close out the presentation on a very inspiring, action-oriented, optimistic note. So I really appreciate that. No pressure, Paula. All right, let me put this.
Okay, let me see if technology is with me. All right, before we get there. So I have the very easy task to remind us and remind ourselves that we have not yet been defeated. And I think that we really need to keep that in mind. You know, Neil has asked us, what are they going to create? I think we should be very busy with what are we going to create? Because it's not because fascism and the far right are at our door that it means that we need to become compliant and need to wait the storm to pass. We have not yet lost our agency, and a lot of us have actually extensive experience in working in very challenging environments. We have a lot of experience in terms of feminists from the global south, in terms of dealing with US imperialism. This is not for us. It hasn't started in February 2025. Do you know what I mean? We're in the region that have extensive experience of foreign intervention and US imperialism, and yet has managed to harness collective power and transnational solidarity to make the quickest and to make the greatest advances on abortion rights that we have seen in the last couple of years. So just as a reminder to us that, yes, this is very grim, but it is also a tactic of the anti-rights and the anti-gender crowd to distract us, to create so many fires that we're so busy looking at what they're doing and what they're putting out and the events that they're creating that we're left with nothing. We're running on so little energy and funds that we cannot afford to be looking at them. Yes, we need to monitor them. Yes, we should not be undermining them. But I would urge us not to create a myth out of them. They're not that special. Really. I spent my whole career in UN negotiating rooms in Geneva looking at these people, WhatsApping Russia and whatever, and looking at their arguments and like, really? It's you? It's you? Really? They are not that special. And everything that they have managed to achieve, it's thanks to us, actually. Because 20 or 30 years ago, very few states were collaborating with them. So they took a step back and they analyzed everything that we were doing in terms of the human rights movement, the feminist movement, the social justice movement. We were mobilizing. We were creating transnational solidarity. We were harnessing global spaces because I think we also need to remind ourselves that ICPD and Beijing didn't happen out of thin air. Feminists went and created these spaces. We created this agenda for ourselves and we brought along states and we brought along UN agencies and we brought along partners. So just for us to have a historical perspective as well as a materialist perspective on what we were able to achieve. And so and then they observed all of that and now they're instrumentalizing human rights mechanisms. They're instrumentalizing human rights law. They are putting their experts in these mechanisms. This is what that they're doing. The narrative that they're creating, this kind of turning and translating religious ideology into something that is palatable so they don't sound so out there anymore. It's all the tactic that they have, like they have looked at us and they have replicated what we have been doing. It's just that now we're at a moment where we need to collectively reimagine and harness our imagination power. I think that we have lost a bit of that, of, like the disability to go beyond the constraints. Like when I'm hearing everything that the US is doing, I'm not waiting for a change of administration. I'm an Arab girl. Listen, no matter the administration, my region, we have kind of endured a lot regardless of the administration. So I'm not waiting for a change in administration. I'm interrogating the system. How come we are in a system that has put so much power in the hands of one single country that it has the power or death or life over millions and millions of people? This is what we need to interrogate, the underlying systems that have brought us here. Therefore, why are we working on a playbook? Women Deliver is an organization, our main offering is our convening power. And so we're leveraging this convening power to try and coalesce around similar messages, around a common political agenda. We're looking at building a feminist playbook. And this feminist playbook, we're seeing this as really as a political declaration that will be launched at Women Deliver 2026. We're traveling the world, quite literally, doing playbook. You probably have seen playbook consultation. We have 2 this week. Everywhere we go, we organize playbook consultations. We encourage our partners to also do these consultations. And this input, this wealth of input that we are getting, we will be translating through a drafting committee, and we will be launching it at Women Deliver itself. There will be consultation circles at the conference as well, so that we can also be defined by not what we're opposing or what we're monitoring, but what we stand for, our own vision. Remember us? What is it that we stand for? What is the world that we want to live in? What does solidarity means to us? So the meaningful solidarity, as in like I stand to lose something by standing in solidarity with that group, but I'm okay with that because this is where our collective political power is. Our goal with the playbook is also to provide clear recommendations. And we are keeping this kind of very big tent approach that Women Deliver has always had. So we will be talking, and we are talking with civil society organizations, feminist organizations, but also donors, also philanthropy, also states. And, I can guarantee that not everyone is really ready to interrogate the underlying systems, but they are participating. And for us, that's already kind of steps onto this path. It's like everyone is in agreement that now is the time for us for transformation. Gramsci used to say, like, now is the time of monsters because the old system is no longer working and the new system hasn't been born yet. But it's not going to get born just out of thin air. We need collective action, and we need to actually do something to birth this new world. So that's our offering at our scale. We're also working in very close collaboration with other initiatives that have published their own manifesto, that have published their own recommendations. And the playbook will include pledges and commitments and recommendations. We are also, because in a lot of conversations that I've been in recently, it's almost as if governments are like looking at ODA being completely defunded and, the collapse of this system as if it had nothing to do with them. So I think we also need to kind of recenter states' obligations under international law and accountability. So as I mentioned, our feminist playbook is not only kind of this declaration that we want to adopt at Women Deliver, it is first and foremost for us a process. The mere process of getting together, of thinking together, of reimagining new realities together, even that is an act of resistance. In this current context, feminists getting together, disagreeing together, because we love doing that, and the different constituencies and building solidarity across different movements, that in itself, even if we don't get like an immediate result, that is planting the seeds for the kind of delineating the contours of a new vision for the world. Who will be involved in the process? As I've mentioned, states, sectors outside of gender equality. So we're also reaching out to labor, to trade unions, to academia, because they are also organizing their global spaces. They're also asking themselves the same questions. It's just that for some reason, we're not talking to each other. I can just invite us to join us in taking action. We have a Women Deliver delegation here until the end of the conference. We have a lot of information available on our website. We have already carried several consultations in New York, here at ICFP in Geneva. We have one in East Africa. I'm going in 2 weeks to Beirut for the Swana one. We have in the Pacific as well. So if you feel that you would like to recommend someone or participate, please feel free to reach out to us and let's work together. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Paula. You're keeping us grounded. You're keeping things real. And I think you're keeping us really motivated as we think about what can we do together next. So I recognize we're actually officially over time. However, this whole panel is about resisting. So unless I see anyone trying to get into this room, I'm going to resist the next session so that we can actually have a few questions. So what I think we'll do is just pass a mic around. We have a couple individuals in the audience. My colleague Monica, I think Vlad, you might have a mic as well. Let's see if we can just keep this to like 10 minutes so we're done by 12 noon. We'll take 3-4 questions and then we'll just pass a mic across the stage here. So please go ahead.
Hello, I'm Ruth from Canada, and I'm a provider. And I would like to ask about the US gag rule. How does that impact the many US foundations that actually support our work?
Okay, great question. We'll take a few more. Some hands in the front.
Gracias. Can I speak in Spanish?
Oh.
Do you have your
In just a
translator?
second.
Okay, I would.
Okay.
Thank you. Muchísimas gracias por sus enriquecedoras intervenciones. Yo soy Lina, soy creadora de contenido digital y creo que una de las grandes, pues de los grandes retos que tenemos alrededor de cómo contrarrestar los grupos antiderechos es esto. cómo utilizamos los dispositivos digitales y las redes sociales y la comunicación digital para hacer resistencia. Y yo encuentro como un debate que me genera mucha confusión. Y es, muchas personas dicen, no les demos bombo a sus mensajes. No hablemos de ellos, ignorémoslos, no reconozcamos esto que existe acá. Pero por otro lado, yo creo que es muy importante informar a las personas de que esto está sucediendo. Entonces, no sé, ¿ustedes qué opinan? ¿Tenemos que hablar de ellos? ¿Tenemos que crear narrativas que también empiecen a informar sobre nuestros aciertos? ¿O por el contrario, mejor los dejamos en la oscuridad digital para que nuestras audiencias que quieren defender los derechos sexuales y reproductivos no les conozcan y no les vean y no les generen más difusión? ¿Ustedes qué opinan? ¿Cómo lo ven? Gracias.
Thank you. My name is Hiba Khatun. I'm a senior communications manager at Data2X, and I'm ex-woman deliver. Hi, Paula. And the team here, of course. I just want to build on, this is not a question, this is like a ask to think about something. So I had the pleasure to facilitate one of the consultations breakout groups this morning, and it was about narrative and language. And one part that Paula, focused on was like, the anti-rights movements are gaining ground by using a narrative that works, that really rooted in fear, loss, exclusion. And we have to form a counter narrative that based on hope, care, solidarity. So one of the things I really admired about the consultation was that, and this is the ask for you to think about, what words served our community that we want to keep, and what words we have to let go. They are not serving us anymore. They are alienating people. They are big words that no one understands anymore. And if we want to be accessible, we have to change them. And the last one was like, what is the tone we want to lead with? And the way I think about the tone is really how these words make you feel out of this. The what is important, the how is important, and the who we are talking to is very important. So this is just a share out from a fraction of that consultation to urge us think about a new shared vocabulary that we have to work. I'm a comms person, and I've been through a lot of press releases and posts that I hardly got because we are still using the same words that divide us and alienate us. We have to work on a simplified language that everyone uses, because the anti-rights movement are using those very words and they're getting into people. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more question. There's a hand behind you, Monica.
Hi, my name is Ragini. I'm from Commonwealth India, and we have been tracking the emerging anti-choice movement and discourses in India since 2023. I mean, all of the things and findings that Neil showed in his presentation, we could already map it in India. Even US-anchored networks like abortion pill reversal networks are already operating in India. My question is that, all of these has been facilitated by a very targeted disinformation campaign. And there's a whole cottage industry of researchers who are coming up with their own research papers. And every time there's a website, disseminating information on abortion pill reversal, they also have, an accompanying findings section where all of these very dubious technologies or processes have some sort of scientific legitimacy. So how do we counter that? Have you looked into that? Thank you.
The mic, please. Okay, thank you. We're wrapping this up in the next few minutes. I'll get the head mic. Okay, thank you so much for the questions. Just to pose these to the panel, I was thinking, Beth, you could handle the question about the global gag rule and its impact on foundations. Neil, you might be best placed to respond to the question about disinformation, the research, and kind of like making things appear scientific, sort of how are we handling that? And then if all of the speakers have, if you want to say a quick word on how we are changing our narrative, adjusting our tone, etc. Unfortunately, I was not able to fully understand the intervention from the woman speaking Spanish because the translation had a lot of static. So I do want to sincerely apologize for that, but also just thank you for what you shared. Yeah, thank you. So just maybe in just one minute each. Thanks. Oh, yeah, turn it on. Okay. Do we need to cut this off? Okay.
Maybe it's working out. It's
Okay.
working now.
So we're actually being told that we need to end this session. So what I'm going to recommend is catch the speakers on the way out if you ask a question. And I encourage you all to link up with our groups. I know, I'm so sorry. Factors out of our control. We were running behind time. But again, thank you so much to our amazing panelists for sharing your insights and really calling us all to action and to task. We have to work together on these issues moving forward. So let's roll up our sleeves and get to it. Thanks, everybody. I tried. I know. I was like, and then I'm told no. Thank you. That was just